Potsdam, July 1945. For 2 weeks. The leaders of the victorious Allied powers met at a palace outside Berlin to discuss plans for the post-war world. These were men who had fought together against fascism, but they couldn't even agree on how to handle the peace. This was not a very merry band. We've got Harry S. Truman, the tired-looking President of the United States. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister who'd recently survived an attempt on his life, and representing the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, who had just taken back his country from Nazi Germany, only to find it devastated by war and deeply resentful of the capitalist powers for their failure to fully support him in his time of need. The three of them, plus their staffs, met to discuss 3 main goals. First, what should the post-war order look like? Second, what should be done with Germany? And third, what should be done with the rest of Europe? On the first point, Truman wanted to reassert the old order, with Britain and the US dominating Europe and East Asia, and the Soviet Union dominating nothing. Stalin wanted the opposite. With the Soviet sphere of influence dominating Eastern Europe, and with the US and Britain having no spheres of influence at all, it's basically the question of spheres of influence was the big point of contention at Potsdam, and it would become one of the major sources of Cold War tension. But there were 2 other issues that almost caused a walkout. One was reparations, which Britain and France wanted to use to rebuild their war-torn economies. And the other was the treatment of Poland, which had been completely overrun by the Soviets. In the end, the Allies agreed to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones and to hold free elections in Poland. But the underlying tensions remained. And this is why it helps to remember that despite their alliance, neither the Americans nor the Russians trusted the other. In fact, the Americans had been suspicious of the Soviets from the very beginning. They knew that the Bolsheviks were communists, and they believed that communism was inherently evil. That's because it was anti-democratic, anti-American, and anti-capitalist. So when the communists took over Russia in 1917, the US refused to recognize their government and joined with the other Allied powers to fight against them in the Russian Civil War. Then after the war, the US imposed economic sanctions on the USSR in order to prevent it from becoming a threat to its neighbors or to itself. But these efforts failed, and instead made Stalin paranoid about the USS intentions towards him and his country. And Stalin's paranoia was well-founded because throughout the war, American policymakers discussed how to contain communism. In fact, at the very moment that Stalin was meeting with Truman and Churchill at Potsdam, George Kennan, an American diplomat, was writing a secret memo outlining the need for a long-term policy of containment against the Soviet Union. And so at Potsdam, Stalin kept interrupting the discussions about post-war Europe to remind everyone that he did untrust the Americans and that he feared their intentions towards his country. But nobody listened because everybody else was still celebrating victory and they didn't want to get bogged down in this paranoid nonsense. They'd deal with the USSR later. So in the meantime, Stalin left after a few weeks to take the Eastern European states that he had already occupied. And the Americans and British went ahead with their plans to rebuild Western Europe. As soon as they could, they helped West Germany establish a democratic government and a capitalist economy. And they did the same thing in Austria and Italy. But at the same time, the Soviets were doing the exact same thing in East Germany, Poland, and Hungary. So the continent was divided into 2 competing zones, each backed by one of the 2 superpowers. That meant that the next time a war broke out in Europe, it would be a war between the USA and the USSR. But that's a topic for another video. To see how this conflict escalated into a global crisis, check out the series in the description below.